It seems to be that for you, the Russian Revolution and the failure of it, it's something which somehow structured the whole historian framework of the whole. And you consider that as something that it must be taken in account in order to understand cinema nowadays. Can you explain us why you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I would obviously say not just cinema, but culture, politics, social life, because, again, this is complicated. These are big questions. Because we see the Russian Revolution not as a Russian event, but as the outcome of 3/4 of a century of an international socialist culture, which had, of course, a very specific political character or a political element, but also it was influenced by, fed from art, culture, historiography, even you might say psychoanalysis perhaps, sciences. And it created this international culture which culminated in the Russian Revolution in 1917, which was not a Russian, exclusively Russian event. It was a global event. And it was the first time in world history, whereas Edmund Wilson said in To Finland Station, Western man for the first time sort of took control of his fate. And he was not a Marxist, but he recognized that October 1917 represented something fundamental. For the first time, human beings consciously set about organizing their social and economic life. First time the oppressed took power, in my opinion, the decisive event of modern history. The degeneration of the Russian Revolution, the rise of Stalinism, the rise of this horrific bureaucracy, which, of course, murdered off the entire generation that made the revolution, including Trotsky, but many, many, many thousands, hundreds of thousands of others. The flower, I mean, people, artists, writers, intellectual workers who had dedicated decades were given 10-minute trials in 1937 and shot in the back of the neck. Thousands a week. A genocide. We call it a genocide of socialism that Stalin carried out. Well, that had incredible ramifications, and not simply in the Soviet Union, although, of course, above all in the Soviet Union. But let me, for example, say that I think the rise of people like the Frankfurt School, Marcuse and others, and I'm not demonizing them. They were Jewish intellectuals who were very perturbed, obviously, by the rise of Hitler. I think they made completely wrong conclusions from it. But the rise of people like that is partly by default, because the genuine Marxists literally had been murdered off. Vronsky, Trotsky, and Rakovsky, and the whole generation had just been eliminated from the face of the planet, and that had terrible, terrible implications. Just as I would say the murder of Rosa Luxemburg had terrible implications in Germany. So there's that element of it. For culture, I think that culture, that international socialist culture that had received enormous blows, both physically, but then later associated with the demoralization of generations. I would say that particularly, again, maybe this is a little mechanical, beginning in the late 1930s, around the time of the horrors of the Moscow trials and the horrors, if people wanted to investigate it, of the Spanish Civil War, where the Stalinist secret police were murdering and torturing and making sure there was no revolution, a great disappointment set in, which we have not yet overcome in artistic circles. I would call it the great disappointment. And as I say, it didn't simply murder off a whole layer of people, but it demoralized, disoriented generations. The most noble ideals in history of social solidarity, of equality, were dragged through the mud by this horrible bureaucracy, which in the name of communism and socialism did the opposite. How could that not have an impact on cultural life, which inevitably gravitates towards, I think, culture gravitates towards profound criticism of what exists. And therefore, the destruction of the most critical element, the Marxist element, had extraordinary implications.
Following that, it's quite interesting to see in the 30s and in the 40s, after the Great Depression, American films, for instance, they took that feeling of at that moment. You see Chaplin, you see even There are many films that I remember now. Hallelujah, I Am a Vamp by Levi Milestone, which is a musical but takes that feeling in the film. It seems to be that in that moment there was most sensitivity towards that process, social process, that nowadays we are lack of it. How do you see that?
Yes, I certainly think that's true. Hollywood is not just a profit-making commercial enterprise, some kind of monolith. That's never been our attitude, even today for that matter. I wouldn't say it's simply some monster. Mm-hmm. There were many, many talented, extremely talented people, both American, obviously emigres from all over the world. At a certain point, particularly emigres from the Nazis, Jewish emigres, but many others who came. And of course Chaplin from Hitchcock from England. What did Jefferson say in 1789? Every citizen, every person in the world has two countries, his own and France. Well, I think I wrote it somewhere. In a certain sense, everyone in the film world has two worlds, his own and Hollywood. It's inevitable. I mean, it was it meant something, and it wasn't just rubbish. Mm-hmm. Of course, there were many, many problems, and you had and this was done within the framework of the profit system and profit-making studios and so forth and so on. But there were still extraordinarily lively, talented, interesting people there. And the events of the century, the Russian Revolution, the Depression, had an enormous impact in the United States. There was a huge radicalization after 1929. I mean, if you ever look at the statistics, the misery that millions of people were plunged into almost overnight had an enormous radicalizing effect. Capitalism, almost like that, became a dirty word. The banks, Wall Street, big business. Now, how that reflected itself in film obviously was very contradictory and complicated. It couldn't be open for the most part. It couldn't. And you had that production code to make sure that it wasn't, and incredible censorship, in fact. I did that review of that Anthony Mann book recently, and that's the 40s and 50s, granted, but the continuous stream of letters saying, you can't do this, you can't show the police in this light, you can't show the church in this light. I mean, just endless. The fact that anything was made is astonishing. And yet they did. They found ways, partly through film language, partly through many ways, to get around some of those difficulties. And you have, as you know, very subversive films throughout that period. But certainly the Cold War, the anti-communist witch hunts had a big impact. Criminalizing sort of left-wing thought, criminalizing anything that was genuinely critical of the foundations of American society. After that, you had to genuflect to the greatness of American democracy. In the 50s, you could say all sorts of things, about personal problems, even about racism and various issues, but you could never say, look, this system is rotten to the core.
Yes.
That you had to bow to. As long as you did that, you were okay. And Cold War liberalism sort of set in, because the liberals made a deal with the McCarthyites to get rid of the Stalinists, to get rid of the Communist Party. And they made a deal with the devil, and the consequences were terrible for American culture.
Le presento a Su Majestad a Rupert, nuestro editorialista.
Encantado, Rupert.
Lo mismo digo.
Siéntate. Dime, ¿qué estás leyendo?
A Carlos Marx.
No serás comunista, ¿verdad?
Hay que ser comunista para leer a Carlos Marx.
Rupert.
Una respuesta razonable. Si no eres comunista, ¿qué eres entonces?
Nada.
¿Nada?
Cualquier forma de gobierno me fastidia.
Pero alguien debe de gobernar.
No me gusta la palabra gobernar.
Bueno, si no te gusta la palabra gobernar, digamos mandar.
El mando en el gobierno significa poder político, y el poder político es la forma más directa de oprimir al pueblo.
¿Qué dice usted que escribe en la revista?
El comentario sobre la actualidad. Perdone, Su Majestad.
Pero, mi querido amiguito, la política es necesaria.
La política es un montón de reglas impuestas al pueblo.
En este país las reglas no se imponen, son el deseo de los ciudadanos libres.
Viaje un poco y verá la libertad que tienen.
No me has dejado terminar, yo...
Todos van metidos en una camisa de fuerza y no pueden mover un pie sin pasaporte.
Permíteme que termine.
En un mundo supuestamente libre se violan los derechos de cada ciudadano.
Pero no me dejas que...
Se han convertido en esclavos de los déspotas políticos.
Sí, pero déjame...
Y si uno no piensa como estos, le retiran el pasaporte.
¿Me permites?
Salir del país es más difícil que fugarse de la cárcel.
Sí,
y entrar
pero...
en el país es tanto como pasar por el ojo de una aguja.
Pero sí...
Soy libre para viajar.
Claro que sí, a donde tú quieras.
Solo si poseo un pasaporte.
¿Quieres dejarme que...
Solo si poseo un pasaporte.
Sí,
¿Lo necesitan los animales?
No, ¿has terminado ya?
Es una incongruencia que en la era de la velocidad atómica soportemos el lastre de los pasaportes.
¿Quieres dejarme de una vez que te explique?
¿Y la libertad de expresión existe?
No, porque te has quedado con ella.
¿Y la libre empresa?
Hablábamos de pasaportes.
Hoy todo está en manos de los monopolios.
De acuerdo. Ahora
¿Puedo
deja...
entrar yo en el negocio de automóviles y competir con el autotrust?
Si me dejas decirte
Ni
algo...
soñarlo. ¿Y en el ramo de alimentación y competir con los grandes supermercados?
¿Quieres callarte?
Ni soñarlo. El monopolio es la amenaza de la libre empresa. Y si vuelvo la vista 60 años atrás...
¿Dónde estabas tú hace 60 años?
Era solo un chispazo de deseo en los ojos de su bisabuela.
Bueno, ¿qué? ¿Ya has terminado? Pues déjame decirte una cosa. Déjame decirte que estás muy equivocado. En primer lugar... ahora se me ha olvidado lo que quería decir.
You know, as I said this morning, I mean, in the 1960s you had a certain radicalization. I think it was not the most profound and thoughtful radicalization often. It was tended to be kind of student, middle-class radicalism. You know, rejection of this or that, a semi-anarchist, semi-bohemian rejection, but without ever really coming to terms, I think, with the big questions of the 20th century, in some cases because it was too difficult, and in some cases because it cut too close to the bone, frankly. And then, you know, with a change in this after the 1970s, a real turn to the right in big sections of the middle class. The Reagan period, a period of sort of suppression of social struggles and through the unions and the Democratic Party, just the suppression of any opposition. You know, a period of stagnation and reaction set in, which has had a big impact on filmmaking because, as we said, I think it's connected to mass moods and mass sentiments, and the mood for the last 30 years has been a very difficult one. So I think those are some of the problems.
Which for you are the filmmakers that nowadays they are in touch with this kind of way of understanding that reality, social reality, should not only be reflected in a film, but it should be questioned in the film.
Poof. I can't say that there is a single filmmaker that I think is doing that consistently. I mean, obviously, you see individual films, some of the Palestinian films, even some of the Israeli films, certain films from China, certain films in Iran still. I think, Mike Lee is an interesting figure. Obviously, Mr. Turner, I think, is an interesting figure. Interesting film.
When you were saying China, you mean, for instance, Jia Zhenghe?
Yes, at least some of his films, I'm not sure today. Although Touch of Sin, I thought was an interesting film, a pretty hard-hitting film. But I think there's a general problem. I mean, frankly, I can't point to a single figure that I say, yes, he or she is doing it. I think there are, as I say, flashes of insight, individual films that you see, and then it sort of falls away. But I think that will come. A lot of that will come with a change in the social situation, frankly. But again, I'm not pessimistic, but I would be very critical of the present state of things.
I remember one fantastic review you wrote about The House of Mirth by Terence Davis, where you compare The Age of Innocence and Terence Davis, and how the difference between a lot of production, the science production, but Davis with such a small detail can say something about what was going on to be at that moment, and not the whole paraphernalia of this kind of things. I have learned from you to see that.
Well, I think that was a remarkable film, and I think it's a remarkable book. Mm-hmm. That's one of the books, I think, I would say above all, Theodore Dreiser's American Tragedy, but I think House of Mirth is connected to it, that point to the catastrophic character of the American dream and the American illusion in money and status and career, which leads to nothing but disaster. And there was a time in the early 20th century, and of course Great Gatsby is another one along those lines, where there was extraordinary insight on the part of the artist into that. This is a specifically American form, it takes a different form in every country, of that kind of tragic self-delusion of the middle class and various layers of the population. I think that's and I think I think Terence Davies captured some of that in the film. I thought Gillian Anderson was wonderful. It was very sad, very moving film, I thought.
It is, absolutely. Pueden leer a David Walsh siempre en el wsws.org. Allí lo van a poder leer en inglés y a veces también en español, incluso hay partes de su último libro que están traducidas. Volveremos a hablar con David Walsh en alguna oportunidad, volveremos a hablar sobre su libro en algún momento. Es una de las mentes brillantes de la crítica, una voz solitaria en medio de un consenso general en el cual parece ser que el conformismo es la regla del tiempo.